Hello and welcome to the National Rural Press Club being held here at the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, which is coming to you from Ngunnawal and the Ngambri country. My name is Mike Foley. I'm the climate change and energy correspondent for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Our guests today are Anna Neelagama, the CEO of the Real Estate Institute of Australia, Kasy Chambers, who's the Executive Director of Anglicare, and the independent member for Indi, Helen Haines. They will address the press club today on the regional Australia's housing crisis. There's plenty of room, but nowhere to call home. In short, it's fair to say things are crook in Tallarook, to coin a phrase. Regional house building is not keeping pace with population growth. So as an average over the past decade, the total regional population has grown around 76,000 per year, but approvals for new houses is averaging about 50,000, and that's falling. So there's a big gap. Rental vacancy rates have been down to 0.1% in many places, and rental affordability, as you can imagine, is skyrocketing. Please welcome Anna, our first speaker.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the National Rural Press Club for this opportunity. The National Housing Investment Finance Corporation forecasts we will fall short of the number of homes Australia requires by around 106,000 by 2024-2025. It is telling that a regional supply shortfall is not calculated by NEFIC as part of this forecast. At the same time, last week's budget papers forecast overseas immigration to grow a massive 400,000 this year, and next year an additional 315,000. In the context of this massive population growth, fixing housing, and today's topic, fixing regional housing, we know what we need to do. Fixing the problem is actually quite simple. We know for the most the answers. We need to do two things. One, we need to better use the homes we have already built. And two, we need to build more homes. The regions were once seen as the darling of housing affordability. COVID-19 saw the biggest regional property boom since the global financial crisis and the largest regional property boom in Australia's record books. There is good news in this. Many faithful regional property owners were able to capitalise on extraordinary market conditions. We saw many new entries to regional Australia, and we saw for the first time many Australians able to buy their first home in the regions. A record amount of home sales were transacted. To put this in perspective, in regional New South Wales, over 2021 and 2022, there were 20,000 regional property transactions. At the same time, in darling Sydney, the hotspot of Australia's real estate centre, we only saw around 11,000 property transactions. To say it was a boom was an understatement. But we've now seen property transactions and median house price in the regions reverse back to pre-pandemic norms. Over COVID, because of undersupply and because of a very strong cohort of enthusiastic regional renters, rents tightened up considerably in the regions. Today, Australia's national vacancy rate sits at around 1.2%. Regions, however, are showing early signs of this trend reversing. The Blue Mountains vacancy rate is at the highest it's been since the onset of the pandemic, at 2%. The northern coast of New South Wales, the vacancy rate has increased to 1.8%. Somewhere like the Mornington Peninsula is up to 1.7%. And so it goes. We are seeing rent supply and rent pressures reverse significantly from COVID-19 highs. What we are not seeing, of course, is a reverse or a decline in affordability. Rents have gone up around 6% for housing in regional Australia and up to 9% for other dwellings. So we are seeing some early green shoots that the pressures on the rental system in the regions are reversing, but it still falls well short of the healthy 3% vacancy rate and can't be considered universal across Australia. These trends have been borne out by the RAI Regional Movers Index, which is down around 48% from pandemic highs. The end of the enthusiasm for regional housing that we saw in COVID is not the end of housing challenges in the regions. Supply and affordability will remain a huge challenge. What we don't know is what the direct and indirect consequences of this COVID-19 property boom and investment and Australia's migration forecasts will play out. This story is yet to play out in Australia's regions. Last but not least, over COVID-19 and in the past years, we've seen the rise of short stay accommodation. It has had a particular impact on the regions, some of it positive and some of it not. The reality is, in some states, there is more short stay accommodation in regional areas than capital cities. To give you a few examples, Tasmania records around 3,359 regional Airbnbs versus 2,218 in Hobart. Similarly, Western Australia has 5,463 Airbnbs in their regions versus around 5,022 in Perth. Ria will have more to say about the impacts of short stay accommodation, particularly on the rental pool, in a new report coming out soon. Now, to Budget 2023 and regional housing considerations. It's fair to say housing policy in Australia's regions has been historically rather poor. The Great Sea and Sea Change and agricultural boom of the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated our housing policy in the region is ill-equipped and our housing needs in the regions undersupplied. It also prompted a new wave of to-be-completed construction in the regions. Regional housing is an area that has always required greater attention. And it's an area that requires different levels of programs and investment by each state and territory as they have vastly different regional housing requirements. To paint a picture for you, in Queensland, 53% of Queensland's housing stock is outside of the metro areas and is in the regions. In Tasmania, this is as high as 59%. In Victoria, however, only 26% of the housing stock is in the regions. So what can be done? Most of the policy settings are just about laying the foundations for better decision-making and data. The NEFIC State of the Industry report should include a breakout regional supply forecast. The to-be-finalised National Supply and Affordability Council should be setting and monitoring highly localised housing targets by LGA based on population growth predictions. Housing and homeless ministers should consider regional housing as a standalone and standing agenda item when they meet. And the next National Housing and Homelessness Agreement should have weighted spending based on where housing is in each state and territory and balance the needs of the metros and the regional populations. Last but not least, in a very high inflationary environment and a sluggish economy, we need to look at highly targeted programs in our region where they've got the best opportunity to grow the economy and build homes there as rapidly as we can to house key workers through prefabricated homes, modular homes, and any homes we can get on the ground quickly. It's all fairly dry but important stuff, with most business, housing and community stakeholders and advocates aligned. This is not the controversial side of housing, guys. There are a few other key do-now things we can do to support the regions in the context of Budget 2023-24. Around $60 million was allocated for the new National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. We should use small sums of money for this too. Contact all ratepayers in Australia through different LGAs and get them to seek any empty or latent homes back into the permanent rental pool. The Eurobadalla Shire on the South Coast did this and successfully got 80 new properties back into their rental pool. All LGAs should be doing it and the federal government should fund it. The second thing we must do is an occupancy audit of local, state and federal government-owned housing and land. So many of our rural and real estate agents can point out the sad case of police houses, teachers' houses going empty, of state-owned land being land banked and not developed. This is unacceptable and we must do something about it, and it would only take a small amount of money to do this work. Last but not least, all Australians have been challenged by the cost of living, and the recent announcement in the budget for the increases to the Commonwealth rent assistance were welcomed by RIA. And we argued this could go further to peg Commonwealth rent assistance to market rents, because it simply has not kept pace with the market. The reality is we need a lot of different people to do a lot of different things to fix housing, and in doing so, fix regional housing. We need to, amongst other things, build and fund the shortfall of housing in Australia and be clear about what this means for regional Australia. We need state planning ministers and LGAs to clear any planning backlog. We need leadership from the federal government in the industry and skills portfolios to support our construction sector to do this in their weakened state and fix their current skills crisis. Regional housing is an area that has always needed greater attention. For RIA, we have joined the National Alliance for Regionalisation, which brings together 30 peak bodies to do this and provide that specific regional lens that we need to solve regional housing problems across local, state and federal governments. The answers are hard, but they're fundamentally very simple. We need to better use the homes that we have already built, and we need to build more homes. Australia's regions have so long offered so much promise, and with the political will and collaboration of many, our regional housing requirements can be met. I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks, Anna. Please welcome Kasy Chambers from Anglicare.
Good afternoon, Press Club members, distinguished guests and friends. We're all here because Australia's housing crisis has never been more dire, nor more widespread. It's spread across income groups and it's moved from the city into the regions. You can go few places now without hearing stories about people's rental difficulties, their mortgage payments, or just even an ability to find a home. Let me start by establishing the fact that Anglicare, at least, and many of the rest of us here today, believe that housing is a basic foundation for civil life. It's a human right. If we don't have housing being a foundation for everything else, for education, for employment, for health, those don't stick either. We've got to get housing right. Now, Anglicare Australia has a particular interest in rental housing. Renters and rentals have been more in the public eye recently, but when we started our rental affordability snapshot, it was virtually invisible in public policy. However, we know that more Australians live in rental housing and more of us are spending longer in rentals. Where it used to be the domain of singles for transient periods, now families, older people, in fact, many of us will live out our whole housing career in rental housing. And in fact, a third of Australians now live in rental housing. Housing policy, however, still seems to be stuck viewing it as a transient form of residence. Now, we began our rental affordability snapshot 10 years ago, and there was certainly then a belief that regional areas were more affordable. Well, that wasn't the truth then, and it certainly ain't now. So when we come to 2023, there is no region right across Australia that is affordable for people on low incomes and government benefits. Now, I'll take a moment with the national picture because it's stark and it bears some thinking about. And then we'll do a bit of a tour of some regions. But this year we looked at nearly 46,000 rentals right across Australia. What we found when we looked at various households was that out of those 46,000 listings, 4 rooms in share houses were available across Australia, were affordable for someone on the job seeker allowance. That's 4 rooms in share houses right across Australia. That doesn't, when we do a percentage, we have to have way too many zeros to make that sayable at something like this, particularly if anyone's had a glass of wine. We were grateful to see that the budget did pay some attention to job seeker, though of course it wasn't enough. When we factored in that $40 a fortnight, that did actually raise the number of affordable rentals to 5. There were then 5 affordable rooms, again all in share houses for somebody who's single and living on that benefit. No one on government benefits fared any better, and for the first time this year, a single person working full-time on the minimum wage could afford less than 1% of the rentals. That's our agriculture workers, it's our retailers, it's our hospitality staff, it's our security staff. That's less than 1% of all rentals if they were working full-time. Now, that's the national picture. We're here today to talk about regional housing. Now, regional Australia is not homogenous. Of course, it's not. None of us think it is, and none of us are going to talk about that. But let's just sample some of those regional areas. Let's take a quick tour. And I'm going to have to read here because I've got to remember whether it's 0.1% or 1% or one house, because they're really small numbers. In rural South Australia, only 1% of available rentals were affordable for an aged pensioner. Now, most of us would know that the age pension is the most generous of the benefits. In central Queensland, 9 of the 397 listings were affordable for a couple with 2 children on JobSeeker, both parents on JobSeeker. On the north coast of New South Wales, of course, very hard hit by the floods, but bushfires before that, only 8% of all listings were affordable for a couple both working full-time with 2 kids on the minimum wage. And in the Riverina, not far from here, 2% for a single person on disability support pension were affordable. On the south coast, much beloved by people from around this neck of the woods, nothing for a single age pensioner. And in both the Northern Territory and Tasmania, only 1% were affordable for a couple on the age pension. And of course, in Western Australia, there was nothing. Nothing came and grabbed us at all there, nothing affordable. Now, these figures tell the story of affordability in regional Australia, but they also tell the story of mums and dads, of workers, of people trying to make ends meet. I'll move on from our report now, but it is important that I do point out that when we do this report, we factor in not only the benefits and the wages that people get, but we do already factor into these figures Commonwealth Rental Assistance and Family Tax Benefit A and B, where we have families. Now, we've seen a number of things over the years with our rental affordability snapshot, and we know, as we all know, that the price of housing reflects the jobs available, and that has dropped in the regions. We do not see affordable housing in regions any longer, but you're in effect buying the number of available jobs through the price of your rental mortgage. We've watched rental prices boom and bust along with the mining cycles in WA and central Queensland. We've even been able to see the construction of the Pacific Highway as it's moved northwards up the east coast. And of course, as Anna mentioned, we've seen the effects of Airbnb and those short-term rentals. Now, this shortage of affordable housing in regional Australia has huge consequences right across people's life course, right across every bit of their life. But one set of consequences not often talked about that I wanted to join the dots on today is that of aged care. There are at least 2 things that are going on here. Firstly, aged care employees are finding it hard to find affordable housing close to their work. Now, we saw that the wages will be addressed in last year's budget, but even so, many regional providers of aged care are at crisis point in terms of attracting employees to work for them because of the housing issue. And of course, it's not just aged care. The Mayor of Port Hedland last year called out the fact that it is housing that is having the main effect on regional development and well-being. However, in aged care, regional residential facilities are closing down. Close to where I'm standing today, services in Bombala, Bega, Eden and Cooma have closed or are in the process of closing. Now, when we look at that then from the older person's point of view, if they've been in private rental, if they're not able to sustain that private rental because of affordability or because they can't adapt it, they're looking for residential aged care sooner than their counterparts in owned housing. And when they're there in a regional area and there isn't that residential aged care to go to, tragically that compounds into older people moving from the small towns they've lived their lives in, that their communities and families are in, many miles away. In the cases of those towns I've just mentioned, they're coming to Canberra, which can be a 6-hour round trip. There's not too many of their elderly friends and their community who are going to be able to make that very often. Now, I also wanted to take this opportunity because I'd shoot myself if I ever had a microphone and didn't talk about the Stage 3 tax cuts. And I want to point out that they will not assist regional housing or, in fact, regional life in general. Modelling by Anglicare Australia, which has been added to by other groups since, shows that the 10 electorates with the lowest benefits from these tax cuts are all regional electorates. In fact, they're all national seats. In terms of the states that come up when we do the analysis via the state that comes off worst is Tasmania, one of our most regional states, and in fact the one with the lowest housing affordability and some of the lowest wages. So let's be clear, the benefits from those tax cuts will flow away from regional Australia and right into our inner city areas. So are there any solutions? Do we have any solutions? Well, we certainly do have an incredible level of crisis, which we've at best sleepwalked into and at worst callously created. However, we do have money. We have money in various places, apart from the Stage 3 tax cuts. But the last 3 decades have marked a shift in how the federal government tackles housing. It used to fund and build homes as its answer to housing affordability. This provided secure homes for working people for those on low incomes. In fact, our own Prime Minister often talks about the opportunities that he gained through being brought up in public housing. And he's not the only one. There are a number of figures who I have seen speaking at this microphone who are very proud to have been brought up in public housing. Stan Grant, Jennifer Westacott, for examples. It also ensured, when we did it that way, that regional communities got the homes that they needed, instead of being at the mercy of where builders found profit to build. Now, this changed in the 1990s, when the government began to rely on the private market to do the heavy lifting for affordable housing. It changed to offering people concessions and incentives, instead of providing the affordable homes itself. Where we used to spend money directly on building houses, we've shifted that expenditure into Commonwealth rental assistance, negative gearing, and capital gains tax concessions. And we now spend more Commonwealth dollars per capita on those 3 payments than we ever did, and yet housing affordability has never been lower. So anyone can see that this approach is failing. The shortage of affordable rentals has been soaring since 1996, and even though every region in Australia does actually have an oversupply of housing. Supply continues to be a fairly easy solution to talk about. It's not easy to build, it's not easy to develop, but at least it's an easy solution to talk about. Yet we already build between 165,000 and 240,000 new homes each year, a figure that's growing faster than our population. But this is the rub. Even though the supply is growing, this supply of affordable housing isn't, and that's what we've got to work on if we're going to enable regional Australia to remain vibrant. Building homes is only part of the answer. We need to make those homes affordable, and that's something that the private sector cannot do on its own. We need to make sure that social and affordable housing keeps pace with our population. We know that private rentals don't trickle down. Britain's learnt this lesson. Trickle down ain't working any longer. And we also know that those private rentals don't trickle down. But social housing does actually have benefits that actually flow out to all Australians. It helps people in need, it frees up cheap rentals for everyone else, and it builds communities after disasters like floods and fires. It's a lifeline for rural and regional areas where profit-driven housing doesn't always flow to. All of this sounds like a no-brainer, but building homes costs money. We need to build 25,000 homes each year for the next decade to make sure that we keep up with social housing. Our current rate is about 3,000, nowhere near what it's going to take to house these people that actually do the work that keeps Australia and regional Australia flowing through. I often think when I look at those minimum wage occupations, they are the very ones that were at the front line of that COVID pandemic that we all remember a couple of years ago. Now, of course, the current government didn't create this crisis, it inherited it, but some government's going to have to jump on this, and it doesn't change the fact that years of government decisions from both colour governments have created this problem. It is going to take time, but we need to make sure that regional housing remains as a specific point and a specific thought in government policy so that we can attract housing to the regions. Rental stress, insecurity, homelessness does not have to be the way of the future, as it is becoming. We can and must invest in more affordable homes for everyone, for the people that need them most. Our hope, as this rental crisis spreads out to the regions, as it climbs the brackets of income, is that Australia will finally reach a tipping point that spurs the right kind of action.
Thanks, Kasy, and please welcome Independent Member for Indi, Helen Haines.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people on whose lands we meet today, pay my respects to elders past and present, and remind us all that we are coming into a referendum this year to establish a voice in our constitution. Thank you to the Press Club. Thank you to my co-speakers. Fantastic to hear from them both, and I so appreciate, as a Member of Parliament, the extraordinary data that they provide to people like me to help me in navigating legislation and in putting forward evidence-based policy. In the more than 35 years that I've lived in my rural and regional electorate of Indi in northeast Victoria, beautiful 29,000 square kilometres of it, I've never seen a situation in housing like we're seeing today. Whether I'm in a small town or a large regional centre, people tell me how hard it is to find a place to live that's affordable and appropriate to their needs. And they tell me that they're shocked to see people living in tents in our council parks, to learn of the countless people couch surfing. This used to be a story of the cities, but this is a story of country Australia too. The situation is gut-wrenching for people who are homeless, for the would-be homeowners, for the mortgaged homeowners, and especially for the renters. According to National Campaign Everybody's Home, 61.4% of Indi residents are experiencing mortgage stress. 40.6% of renters in Indi are experiencing rental stress. The combination of rising rental prices, a decline in the supply of affordable housing, and a rise in living costs like groceries, petrol and power means people are facing desperate situations. In the worst case scenario, people are living without a stable roof over their heads at all. According to the 2021 census data, Wangaratta, my hometown, its homeless population has grown by a staggering 67% since 2016. Let me tell you about a man I'll call Richard, who I met at the local shower block in the park. Richard is a fully qualified chef. His personal circumstances hit rock bottom after mental health challenges, struggles with substance abuse, and a relationship breakdown. He lost his home and he cannot access something else affordable to rent. He lives in a tent. His car was vandalised and rendered unroadworthy, and recently all of his tools of trade were stolen from his tent. Now, theoretically, Richard could walk into a job in just about any hospitality venue in northeast Victoria. They are screaming for chefs. But his housing situation has made that completely impossible. The lack of affordable housing in Indi has consequential flow-on economic impacts. Whenever I speak to a business owner, they tell me they're unable to fill job vacancies because people cannot find anywhere to live. Towns, beautiful towns like Beechworth and Bryde, are struggling to find hospitality workers where there is just no housing available. Many usually bustling cafes who came back after COVID are being forced to let the passing traffic just walk on by because they cannot open every day. They have no staff. They have no staff because there is nowhere to live. Now, Rural Councils Victoria estimates that if we don't build the extra homes needed, we could lose up to $1 billion in gross regional product over the next 15 years. Once we used to say, build it and they will come. Well, they've come and we haven't built it. Regional Australia grew by 70,000 in the first year of the pandemic, and this year regional migration is up 16% on pre-pandemic levels. And more people want to come to the regions. Why wouldn't they? They are magnificent. They want to come. And we need to house them. And we need to house the people who live there as well. And we need to house people in our communities for all of their lives. And I really, really thank Kasy for the point she made about aged care. I am seeing that play out in my communities. It's important when we speak about housing issues to define the issue we are trying to solve. In Australia, especially in the regions, the heart of our problem is the desperate lack of housing supply. The National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation estimates we will have a housing shortfall of 106,300 dwellings in the next 5 years alone. Now, I'm the first to acknowledge there is no silver bullet to this problem, and all three levels of government, federal, state and local, must come together to find a solution. And we need to bring our non-government sectors to the table: builders, architects, academics, developers, community housing providers, NGOs. The government's National Housing Accord is a great start towards recognising that solving this problem is going to take everyone. And at the centre of it, it must be communities as well. Our communities must get on board. In regional Australia, I want to see solutions that work across those communities, solutions that helps those who are experiencing homelessness, as well as solutions to house our essential workers. Now, in my electorate of Indi, the largest workforce, over 11,000 people, work in healthcare and social assistance. We need to grow that workforce into the future. We are desperately short of health workers. But again, we need to find them somewhere to live. At the federal level, the government is proposing a pathway out of the crisis through their Housing Australia Future Fund bill, the HAF, which plans to build 30,000 new long-term social housing properties. Now, I supported this bill in the lower house because I want to see building start on these homes as soon as possible, and I want to see these homes built in regional Australia. And I know this bill is not perfect. Negotiations in the Senate have already seen improvements. There's now a promise to index the maximum payout from the fund and lift rental assistance. But more could still be done. I want this bill to pass so I can go back to the government and say, now, what are we doing specifically for rural and regional housing? I successfully secured amendments to ensure that the Housing Supply and Affordability Council could have a regional focus when undertaking its work. It's amazing that it didn't, but it does now. I'm proud of that. I'm pleased about it. It's a great start. During the last Parliament, I spoke with our local councils and asked them directly what they needed in order to unlock more land for housing. And this is what they told me. Helen, they said, fund critical enabling infrastructure. Infrastructure like functioning sewage systems, drainage systems that communities like Wangaratta and Benalla in my electorate desperately need to fix. But local councils with very, very small rural ratepayer bases don't have the money to do massive investment like this. And without this infrastructure, it's going to be hard to fix the crisis in supply. Let me give you a wonderful example from Wangaratta. The local council own the former technical school site close to the city centre. The council have earmarked this site to deliver a social, affordable and key worker housing precinct to help meet the critical demand for housing in our region. And they've chosen Nested, a not-for-profit social enterprise, to deliver their vision of 200 safe, quality, energy-efficient and beautiful houses for young people, pensioners, women at risk of homelessness and essential workers. But right now they need funding to clear the site, including asbestos removal. They also need to build water and sewage infrastructure, then get going with the building. But right now the guidelines of the National Housing Infrastructure Facility don't allow that money to flow. And I'm so delighted the CEO's here today. We're going to talk. So I've put a proposal to the government. I put it to the last government. I talked about it during the election campaign. We need to set up a dedicated regional housing infrastructure fund. Now, this would be a $2 billion fund to unlock investment in new houses by building the basic infrastructure needed for new multi-type developments: private housing, rental housing, social housing, essential worker housing. And it would have the flexibility to fund social infrastructure and provide local government assistance to fast-track planning approvals, because that's a big challenge in the regions. Again, you can't recruit a planner to a regional town. My proposal targets the regions so we can build the roads, the street lights, the poles, the wires, the community centres, the gardens, the rural landscapes that we need to have beautiful amenity and a fantastic neighbourhood. And this fund's an opportunity for the federal government to be a national leader where really it has previously fallen short. And this policy, it actually has some synergy with some of the recommendations made yesterday by the Business Council of Australia. The policy framework set up in 2018 by the last government, the National Housing Infrastructure Facility, or the NIF, manifestly failed to meaningfully solve this problem of rural housing supply. The NIF's purpose is to provide loans and grants to fund critical enabling infrastructure, but in the 5 years since it was set up, very little of this funding has gone to rural and regional Australia, and in fact just 40% of its allocated funding has been spent. So, I want to see that change. It's clearly not meeting Australia's housing demands, particularly in the region, and I say that with respect and a willingness to work together. The NIF has stalled because I believe its mandate is too restrictive. It can't fund those quality of life amenities that I talked about. Under the budget, the manager of the NIF, the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, had their liability cap increased by $2 billion to fund more social and affordable housing. And I really welcome this, but I want to see solutions that are specifically targeted, that are place-based and right for rural and regional Australia. And my proposed Regional Housing Infrastructure Fund would offer a flexible mechanism towards building the regional houses and the communities we so desperately need. Australia has been here before when it comes to housing shortages. Post-World War II, Australia faced a lack of materials and skilled labour, leading to a massive shortage of houses. The Victorian government activated a program called Operation Snail. Anybody heard of that? It's pretty cute. It's not about operating at a snail's pace. It's about bringing materials on your back. And Operation Snail was to fund prefab homes, which ended up producing houses at a rate of 40 a week. With record rises in rent and mortgage stress and a lack of housing availability like we have never seen before in regional Australia, we've got to think creatively. We've got to think contextually about what we need to open up housing stock at all levels. We need medium density housing, we need social housing, we need worker housing, we need clever housing. And we need to bring the community with us. You know, it's why I love being an independent. No matter who is in government, I'm not interested in playing politics. I'm really interested in bringing people together to see results. I really am. And I think we can if we have well-researched, clever, community-led approaches. We've emerged from a huge global disruption, and it's absolutely incumbent upon us now, with that disruption, to disrupt our thinking about the old housing paradigm. Think boldly, make planning and policy change, and work collectively to solve this great big hairy problem. And I look forward to our panel discussion now. Thank you. Ooh, that was the step you warned me about.
Thanks, Helen. So we've heard about these shockwaves of negative effects rippling through regional communities. Families are being forced to move. There's lack of essential workers that are degrading the quality of life in the bush. Homelessness, as you pointed out there, Helen. So what I would like to do is, for a start, to look at what we can learn from the past in this area, given it hasn't been a problem that's just appeared overnight. This has taken some time to get to, as I think everyone pointed out, a housing crisis or affordable housing crisis in the bush. We're at the point now where the federal Labor government is looking to legislate for a future fund of sorts to build new houses, but forgive my cynicism, the funds are yet to flow and we're yet to see how rapidly they flow and where they go. The future for regional Australia is somewhat clouded there. So my question that I'd like everyone to answer, please, is the failure to fix this housing crisis problem a lack of political will? Has it been a lack of political will? Has it been poor policy making that has caused this situation? Or perhaps is it some undesirable behaviours of private industry and the market failure? So if we could start with Helen.
Oh, you want to start with me? All right, Mike. Well, I suspect it's a combination of all of those things. I think largely we have been asleep at the wheel while this has grown to become an escalating problem. I think there's been many assumptions made in Australia around housing. I think this idea of us, in the opening title, plenty of land, not enough houses. We have this idea that we have an ever-expansive area to create housing. But what we haven't really thought about is this segmented element to housing. We haven't thought about the people who we've talked about today who can't enter a market. So I guess fundamental economics of supply and demand, we don't have the supply and yet we have great demand. And as I said in my remarks, we don't have a mixture of housing stock and we really need it. And I think as Australians, we've been rather shy, particularly in the regions, about medium density housing. I think that our thinking has been constrained by believing that because we have so much land, therefore we build the 3 and 4 bedroom home with a backyard. But in fact, when I talk to young people, they tell me they don't want that. We know that we don't have investment in regional Australia for homes to rent. We have plenty of investment in Airbnbs, for example, but we don't have investment in long-term rentals. So I think it's a combination of several factors.
Kasy?
I was simply going to answer yes. You know, all three of those, I think, are playing a part. I think there is a sense, as you've said, of the governments of the last couple of decades being asleep at the wheel. And of course, the government that is going to tackle it is going to have to take the most action. And that's the thing, the longer that's been kicked down the road, it might have been easy for the governments, but it's made it worse and worse. And of course, we all know that the longer we leave, I don't know, a car rusting in the paddock or whatever, it's going to take more money, it's going to take more to get it back again. So I think there is that sense that there's been an asleep at the wheel. But I think, you know, I talked a lot about rental housing and I'll stay in that space. There has been poor policy. What we've seen through Commonwealth rental assistance, through the capital gains tax concessions and through negative gearing, is we've tried to incentivise the private market to actually fill that gap for affordable housing. And it's not suitable. That's not what private investment does well. Because on the other side of that are policies that are about individual people gaining retirement income, gaining their individual wealth. So we've asked one thing to do something that it's not capable of doing. So we really need to turn that around. As I said in my remarks, there's more being spent in those areas now of Commonwealth rental assistance and negative gearing and those concessions than we've ever spent in public housing build and social housing. There is a need for that clever housing. There's a real need to decouple that kind of monogamous relationship between the renter and the landlord, because when the landlord wants their property back, someone becomes homeless and they set out on that. So there's a number of things we need to do. And I don't know if it's poor behaviour on the part of private industry. I doubt it. I think it's them acting like we all do when we're incentivised. We act that way. We can barely help ourselves. There's probably something all of us do that we wouldn't normally do, but actually the tax system makes that viable or something like that. So I don't know if it's poor behaviour, but definitely in wrong incentives in the wrong place.
Anna?
Thanks, Mike. I mean, I think when it comes to housing, we as a nation, we just had a real failure of foresight. In the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years, we had a Housing Supply and Affordability Council, and every year they'd put out a report and it'd say, oh, we don't have enough houses, and we're not going to have enough houses. And then the coalition got in and they said, well, the problem is supply. And we seem to be right back here in 2023 facing the same thing. And, you know, 10 years ago, we knew Australia's population is ageing. We knew home ownership was declining. We knew young Australians, for a range of reasons, had a preference for renting. And we did not plan for that. We did not plan for that as a federation. The feds didn't plan for it. The state governments have been reasonably inactive. And local governments often are left, particularly in the regions, carrying the can. So I'd say it's a combination of all three, but it was a failure to look at housing as a big picture, nation-building issue.
Thank you. And our first question today is from Jamison Murphy.
G'day guys, thanks for your speeches. Regional Australia has a lot of pressing issues. We've got declining populations, a skills and labour shortage. We're lacking education and health services, difficulty attracting and keeping migrants. Housing plays a part in all of those. So the question I'd like you guys to discuss is could solving this housing issue in the regions be the foundation on which we solve these other problems?
Well, that's an important question, Jamison, and I guess I'd like to respond firstly by saying, you know, when I think about regional Australia, I think about it from a strict space perspective rather than a deficit perspective. There are so many strengths in rural and regional Australia. There are so many opportunities, actually, to grow a career, to raise a family, to get a good education and to access good healthcare. The issue is essentially one of the infrastructure to support a growing population. So as we see people move to the regions, they're often shocked that they can't access fast internet to work from home and tap into their city office, for example. They're often very surprised that there's no GP in their town. And they're often surprised, though, that there may be a community health service or there may be a nurse practitioner. They're often surprised that their local high school generates young people who access world-class tertiary education and fantastic skills in technical trades, and that there's jobs there now, more jobs than ever, so that they can stay in the community if they choose to. But you're quite right. We're being held back at the moment because of housing, as we described, I think, pretty comprehensively just now. One of the points I made was about planning, and many people in rural and regional Australia complain that their local government is too slow to get planning permits through. And look, poor old local government, they cop it for just about everything. But they really struggle to attract and retain planners into local councils. And again, one of the reasons they can't get a planner is there's nowhere for the planner to live either. But it's why in the Regional Housing Infrastructure Fund that I talk about, there would be support, that eligible support for planning. I think the Housing Accord might have a go at that as well. I think there's many things that we could do that would make that process smoother. So housing, yes, it's fundamental at the moment in terms of ongoing regional development. Absolutely it is. It's why we're all here today. But I don't want anyone to walk away from here today without understanding that the infrastructure to rural and regional Australia must be invested in at pace in order to provide the kind of locations that people can and wish to work from and in.
I might talk a little bit, about housing as a foundation, and obviously that's even more foundational, because if you haven't got the infrastructure, you can't build the housing. But certainly what we see is that housing is that fundamental thing. If you haven't got that, as you talked about, Helen, Richard, in your electorate, you can't work. It's pretty near impossible. It's very hard to maintain or improve your health if you haven't got good housing. Or even if you've got housing, but it's so unaffordable that you're constantly worrying about whether you're going to make next week's rent, or whether you're going to, put some money on the car insurance so that you can actually travel to your job. We see hundreds of thousands of Australians who come to us right across the regions for emergency relief and assistance. And what they are telling us increasingly, we're seeing more people. We're seeing different types of people. We're seeing people who have incomes, and we're seeing families even with 2 incomes. And what they're telling us is that it's the rent. It's absolutely the rent. They can't afford that. They're having to think about moving back to their family of origin. That's often in the cities. Or they're just having to think about where next. And unfortunately, many of them become those families in the tents on the ovals. But certainly, it's absolutely housing. It's not an easy one to fix, but if we can fix it, we probably would actually be able to spend less money on health, less money on some of those, those programs that ameliorate poverty.
Thanks. I think in the before COVID times, consumers would come to regional agents and they'd say, what are the healthcare, what's the education, and what are the work opportunities? And that would be the primary determinants as to whether they would go regional and buy a regional home. In COVID, the first question would be, is there NBN? That was the most asked question rural and regional agents were asked over the pandemic, because we solved the work opportunities. But I don't think, as Helen's identified, we've solved that critical infrastructure opportunity, given people the assurance of healthcare. And the planner example is just a classic example. where we really just need a kind of a hit squad with flyer planners all over Australia to sort out issues where housing is needed the most and unlock some funding to enable that. I think you're right in the sense that the Housing Accord sets the intent to achieve that, but I think we've got to shift beyond the intent and turn sort of that into action and actually get some pragmatic solutions happening, particularly in that planning space, because that will enable critical infrastructure in the regions.
And our next question is from Jacob Stamen.
Hi. Thanks for your speeches. All three of you mentioned how inadequate housing supply has flow-on effects to regional communities. They can't attract essential workers like healthcare professionals or teachers to their towns. Do we need to look at introducing priority housing for these workers that we need to bring in?
Thanks, Jacob. I could give you an example of a project that we're trying to get off the ground in Bright, actually. 7 local government areas, the Hume, RDA, Tourism Northeast all got together and did a whole lot of work about what can we do around essential worker accommodation. And they came forward with a plan that would seek investment from government, from private developers, from social enterprise to build homes to rent in that beautiful alpine village of Bright and open up that opportunity so that the nurses who are currently living in the caravan park might be able to live in a rental accommodation. It's really hard to get investment in this. I've taken it to the Housing Minister. We've got very nice materials that demonstrate the intent of this and the opportunity for this. But again, the way our funding models work, it's extremely difficult to get government investment. Again, we wouldn't be able to get government investment at present through the NIF, and a local developer wouldn't invest in something that was homes to rent. So we're in a bit of a difficult one, and I'd love to work it out. But people are trying to come up with solutions, but we just haven't got the policy levers quite right to make it happen.
It is crazy, isn't it, how we've made such a complex thing of something that's so absolutely essential to us all. I mean, the one comment I'd make is I think that, in terms of those essential workers, yes, we need to be prioritising them. But as Anna said earlier, we've had a bit of a failure of looking forward, and we might not know who are the essential workers of 20 years hence. So yes, it might be a good way to think about prioritising some housing, getting those essential workers into those regions. But we really do need to be looking very holistically so that we're not just then left with a housing problem for people who aren't essential.
And I think there's something that can be learnt from cities there. So there are some developments in Melbourne where they're mixed use. A lot of the properties are going to private market, but there's a certain amount set aside for key workers. And I think that's a model, if you're doing developments in the regions, that you could easily use. So you've got to look at those best practice, things that are working now, things that can be done to support our key workers and house them in the regions.
Nick Stewart from the Canberra Times.
Thanks very much for such detailed and factual speeches. One of the things, though, that I wasn't sure if Kasy actually realised is that you had a lot of detail about Tasmania, but they're getting a big stadium that will work in Hobart to really make people feel better. Are you suggesting that there is something more that needs to be done than actually just building a stadium, that actually building houses, devoting a couple of $100 million to houses might better suit the people of Tasmania? Helen, can I ask you, you provided details about how long it takes to get somewhere. How does that compare to the difficulty of buying a well-made macchiato in Leichhardt, particularly when the people who are coming to our Anthony Albanese's electorate to make coffees for them are having to come perhaps, even 3/4 of an hour by train or bus. How is it that you change the focus of people like Anthony Albanese from the coffee shops of Leichhardt to rural areas? What can you do in order to do that? And finally, and just quickly, Hannah, the question you made is, talking of Anthony Albanese, you may not be aware that he actually grew up in public housing.
I am aware.
Is that the answer? I mean, is the reality that private investing in this area has just broken down and we now need serious government investment in this?
We might start with Kasy to break it up this time.
Well, I might not always be the brightest pencil in the toolbox, but I think I detect a smidge of irony there. Yeah, look, I mean, Tasmania, and we've seen the protests about that. It's I wouldn't want to necessarily get between a footy fan and their oval, but certainly it seems just ridiculous. It seems the wrong way to do things when you're building something like that will not only remove people from the community that they've formed in that space, but also will presumably draw more people to Hobart. And certainly when we look at our rental affordability snapshot across the 10 years, I'm not sure that I could just say that this is causal, but the more famous Mona gets, the more Airbnb we get and the more difficult the housing affordability gets. So we need to make sure that if that stadium goes forward, just the same as any of those museums or any great regional attractions, there is the infrastructure, including and especially housing, to make sure that the people who live there and who service the people, who are the essential workers for when those people come, are looked after. But yes, I have to say, if I was the Tasmanian Premier, I'd be going for housing before football. But you can tell I don't play football.
And Anna, you were asked about the role of public policy making and industry in delivering public housing.
Yeah, look, I mean, we've stepped away from public housing as a model, and I guess the PM, who's a alumni of public housing, and our housing minister also, and I guess what they're trying to do is provide a new proof of concept through the Housing Australia Future Fund to fund that sustainably in partnership with private investment, together with government. Is there a role for public housing? I personally would say almost certainly. But I guess the intent of the HAF is to restructure that and find a sustainable way to deliver that at scale. I would say the HAF is still going to be an investment class. So when you talk about things like, rent freezes and rent controls, there's nothing that's going to turn the tap off faster than kind of interfering with pricing in that. So we've got to kind of get behind the HAF, test out this proof of concept, see if it works, and be very clear it's an investment class that we want to grow.
Thank you. And Helen, I think we've got a long way from our starting point there. But
yeah, I think mine came back to a macchiato.
It did, yeah. I mean, I think we could all do with one now.
Well, I'm very pleased to tell you that you can get a macchiato in the bush these days. You absolutely can. But I think the essence of your question, if I understand it correctly, Nick, is that people need to live close to where they work. If you don't live close to where you work, it has an impact on the whole family, actually. You have to leave home earlier in the morning. That leaves little children. It leaves the trip to childcare. It means that you pay more on your, if you're in the city, perhaps you pay more on your public transport ticket. But if you live in the country and you can't get accommodation in the town where you're working, there's no next suburb. Or suburb after. There's a whole other town and no public transport, therefore there's a car required, fuel to be put in that car, and at the price of fuel, that becomes a more expensive operation to go and work in that coffee shop in the equivalent to Leichhardt in rural and regional Australia. So one of the responses, one of my public hospitals, for example, is building like a Medi hotel for workers, not for patients, in order to accommodate them. And this is, again, a hidden cost of regional healthcare, is the cost of accommodating locum doctors and nurses and allied health professionals. It is huge. One of my residential aged care facilities in a small country town tells me it is their biggest expense and they cannot continue doing this. They have to pay the accommodation of the local staff to come and work in that aged care facility. Now, again, there's no houses for them to rent. That leaves them with a motel. People don't like living in a motel for too long, and it's expensive. So we need to have accommodation close to where people work.
And our next question is from Maurice Riley, who's the CEO of the National Press Club.
Thanks, Michael. Builders and developers, we're starting to see quite a few of them go to the wall, and we suspect there'll be more of those. And so, therefore, those private employers and entrepreneurs are probably feeling there's too many risks to try and help you solve these problems. I wonder whether our solution really is a back to the future problem, where in the good old days we had a public works department and they were just charged with fixing, if in this case would be social housing, and I certainly recall, I'm old enough to recall that Sylvia Curley House here in the Canberra Hospital was a big, huge quarters for, for nurses and other medical things. Maybe we've got to go back to the future. How do we sort of, I just don't think private enterprise can fix your problem unless there's a whole range of incentives, and then usually it distorts a market, and usually people think the builder's ripping people off, and they're probably not. At the end of the day, if it's a public works held by government for a dedicated purpose, is the answer going back to the future? World War II was the example that someone put up in their speech there today.
Maybe Anna, we'll start with you. Are you happy to see government get into that space?
Look, I think there's probably a very strong business case for it at the moment. Last week's budget papers did say the construction sector is in a weakened state. We know the kind of repair program for social, affordable public housing is very long and it's extraordinary, and we need help to fix it and troubleshoot it. So I guess we're all for pragmatic solutions that can get housing up to scratch. So I think it's certainly worthy, and perhaps it's something the member for Indi can present to her peers in the lower house. But I think that level of, practical solutions that can be done now, you can deploy rapidly. There's lots of builders looking for work at the moment. Certainly seems sensible. But if you go back to the private sector, yes, we are seeing many, many building and construction firms exit the market. They're having problems with liquidity, they're having problems with skills. We're seeing developments in cities and in regions being put on hold, like in Brisbane the other week, there was a 120 home apartment block that's going to be put on hold indefinitely. So we can't have that. So we need to look and see how can those projects be underwritten, how can we get more skills workers in to actually build these homes. This is the job of federal ministers, whether they like it or not. They've got to get in there and fix it.
Kasy?
Yeah, I think, it still beggars belief to me that a country like Australia has this kind of housing crisis. So whatever we're doing at the moment, it ain't working. I think the other, I'm sort of sitting here thinking, what can I say that's very different? But the other benefit that comes through our public works department, or whatever it's called, is that of secure work. So not only do we see the builders go bust and the housing not finished, but we see numerous people who then get very harmed in that financially and start on their own journey to housing instability, not managing to juggle the weekly budget, and hopefully not, but the end of that road can sometimes be homelessness. So I think there's a lot of time for that, in that what we're doing at the moment isn't working. As I said earlier, the private market is not providing affordable housing. It simply isn't. We're incentivising it the wrong way to do that, so we've got to try something else.
Interesting question, and look, I think that we need to find the evidence if we're going to change something, or if we're going to go back to the future. I would suggest that the Housing Affordability and Supply Council, this is a piece of work they could undertake. Ask the question, do the research. Likewise at the Accord, these are the kind of this is why this is a great forum. These are the kind of ideas that need to go into that Accord, that we need to investigate that and find if in fact that's a valid way to go.
I've got a job for that chef. He can start tomorrow, right? And I'll find him a room. Right?
Well, I would say, Maurice, that I spent many fruitful years in a nurse's home in my youth. It was not a bad place to live.
The next question comes from Tim Lester, who's the Vice President of the National Rural Press Club.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, panel. So passing on apologies today from Kath Sullivan, who's our President, unfortunately unable to be here, but I'm sure she would have loved this discussion. In my day job, I work for the Australian Forest Products Association. So the ultimate renewable, fantastic building material. It is the future of high embedded carbon, low embodied carbon building material. What we're seeing is from local governments and state governments particularly, an urban community, the demands of an urban community actually cannibalising our resource base in one way or another. So it might be because there's an ideology that restricts access, or physically up in Queensland saying, we want to put in 50,000 houses onto what is currently plantation estate. What I'm wondering from the panel is how, you've all talked about joined up government, which completely agree with, that this is a separate issue, although related to sort of urban issue. But clearly the weight of the electorate is urban Australia. So how do we leverage their interests to get regional housing? Preferably, well, and build out of timber.
Anna.
So the question is, how do we get more investment into the regions and build homes in timber? Is that
How good is timber? Yeah.
Yeah, mostly just building timber.
I mean, timber has sort of soared in expense in the past years, and that's presented a problem for many customers. I mean, I think it does offer an attractive investment opportunity. I mean, housing yields are still very strong. They're about 3 to 5%. In capital cities. In the regions, it's more so. So housing is an attractive investment for the private sector, who support around 27% of the private rental market. So I think the business case is there. We've just got to build the homes. We've got some lovely real estate agents in the room who would love to market them for you at a premium. So I think the case for timber and renewables is definitely there. It's a very important part of, I guess, the Australian aesthetic when it comes to building homes. I think we just need to see the prices come down and the investors will come, Tim.
Yeah, well, clearly my vested interest is in building timber. I'm actually really interested in this potential of rural-urban divide. Like, I personally don't like that expression, but it has some utility. If urban Australia is driving the policy, what do we do as regional representatives, as regional advocates, to leverage their interests?
Casey?
I think we do, you know, we're here thinking about regional housing today, and what I've been thinking about as we've been sitting here is, like so many areas of policy, if we don't pay attention to it, if we just think that it'll all come out in the wash, it's not going to get looked after. So we've got to make sure that regional housing is at the front of any housing plans, and congratulations, Helen, on, you know, getting regional housing into those conversations, because otherwise we do it for the maths, and then we we fiddle around the edges and work out how it's going to work for all the left behinds. And those are all the people that we work with. They're the charitable sector, and in this room, it's the regions. So I think we do need to make sure that there's a specific expertise and a specific interest and specific questions that address, you know, how will this affect regional areas, or what effect will this have? I did want to say a word about wood, though, which again is sort of a little bit at a tangent, but it is to say that some of the housing unaffordability that we are seeing is driven by natural disasters, which are increasing. I think we can now stop pretending that we don't have to say that. And Mike, I know you're a climate change correspondent, but we need to make sure that the houses that we currently have are going to be, you know, offer people some resilience to climate change, and the ones that we're replacing them with do also do that. And certainly many of my colleagues around the country are still working with people who are living there, you know, going into their third winter in a pod or a caravan, and those pods they're not suitable because they don't collect water or all these kind of things. So we do need to make sure that we're across the impact that disaster, these natural disasters have on our housing, and start to think into as well insurance and how we look at market insurance in terms of looking after whole communities like Lismore.
And just briefly, Helen, if you could touch on that as
thank
we
you.
run short.
Look, I want to absolutely put it on the table. It's not an us against them, regional, urban. When it comes to housing, we've all got the problem. Today's focus, of course, is regional. When it comes to mobilising the voter base or mobilising the political discussion, one of my very first jobs when I entered Parliament for my second term was to speak to the new Prime Minister and say, I'm from rural and regional Australia, I'm here to help you. Put a focus on it. It's why I go to the trouble of trying to amend bills to put a focus on rural and regional Australia. We need a lens over all public policy that takes into consideration the population that lives outside an urban boundary. Around 30% of us do. That's a fair number of people. So yes, we haven't got the mass in the majority of seats, but you can work as a parliamentarian to put a focus on rural and regional. The second point I'll make just really briefly in response to your flying the flag for timber. I think we've got enormous opportunity with laminated timbers, with the use of SIPs, with forest products, with our pine plantations and so on. You're absolutely right. Brilliant renewable resource. There are some clever housing. I've got a company in my electorate. Can I say their name? I will say their name. Their name is XLAM. They're providing extraordinary building materials that build multi-storey buildings now out of timber. We need to get so much smarter and more creative about what building materials we use. So thanks for raising the timber one.
And, thank you all. Thank you all for your time today. You're all now members of the National Press Club, and would everyone please thank the panellists.
Thanks.